it's completely recirculated through our filtration system every 45 minutes. You'll actually see, if I went to the sides, you can actually see my bubbles will ascend, get caught in the current, and then go horizontal. Also, you can see the fish riding the currents on the sides. If you look carefully, you'll see a fish just jet to the surface or jet to the bottom. They're riding the currents on the edges of this tank, which is where they're the strongest. Lots of water movement in here.
Yeah, lots of water, and it turns over, what, every 45 minutes?
Yeah, that water turnover is really, really important for the health of the corals. They expect a lot of current in the wild, and it actually kind of keeps them refreshed. And also, it's very important that we have clean, clear water for the animals, and it's the proper temperature, the proper salinity. So we have this entire process. The water is constantly monitored in every exhibit here.
Okay, and since you are so close, go ahead, Dr. Glenn, put your hand up next to mine. That gives you an idea of just how thick this acrylic window is. It's 7.5 inches thick. So, very important to keep this water in there and not out here. Now, Diver Glenn, you gave us the signal for a closed coral, just like that, and the symbol for an open coral. Okay, now I did ask the audience at the start what they thought a coral is. So let me ask them for their answer. So the question is, what do you think a coral is? Is it a plant, an animal, or a non-living thing like a rock? So those of you that think coral is a plant, raise your hand. Okay, we have a few hands raised. And those of you that think coral is an animal, raise your hand. Oh, good sampling. Oh. Wait a minute, was he giving you the answer? Okay, let's see what he does.
I would never do that.
Okay, now those of you that think coral isn't living at all, it's just a rock, raise your hand. Okay, so, wow. This is the test now. The answer is coral is actually an animal. It's a little tiny animal, isn't it, Diver Glenn?
It is a little tiny animal. If you look, they look kind of big. Some are fish size, and some corals get really, really big, like bigger than a human being. But it's not just one animal. It's millions of tiny animals that live in what's called a colony. And they're actually tiny, tiny, tiny things. And hard corals build a skeleton out of calcium that they draw out of the water. And that's how coral reefs are built. Some corals do something a little bit different. They just kind of hang out on the hard corals and wait for waves to go by and bring them little bits of food in the water column. But with that, go ahead.
Oh, now I was going to say, since we mentioned to the audience what a closed coral and an open coral look like, why is there a difference?
Well, when a coral feeds, some coral feed, well actually rock corals, when they have these things, they have little filaments on their bodies. And what they do is they actually the water current flows over them, and little bits of food that they eat, like little bits of dead vegetation or detritus or whatever, flow by in the current, plankton, and those little filaments are sticky. And some of them actually have stinging cells on them called nematocysts. And they'll actually take that prey and sting it, or stick to it, and then they'll draw it in towards their mouth. And when they have all their tentacles out, they just kind of sit there and wait for stuff to flow by. They kind of wave like this.
So kind of like that one over there, that soft coral. It looks like it's opened up, fluffy, kind of soft looking, a soft coral, and but there are some over there that are...
They're actually the same species of coral. They're the same animal, same type of animal. They look very different though. One looks like sticks, and the other one looks kind of fluffy. Maybe we should name the coral Fluffy. I hadn't thought of that.
There you go. So one is opened up, the other is closed. The fluffy one is feeding, the other one isn't feeding. And I think the audience might know what corals are related to. Remember that symbol like this? What was that for? The jelly, yes. So corals are related to jellies and the sea anemone. And do you ever want to touch a jelly? No. Why not? Why don't you want to touch a jelly? Go ahead. The two of you, do you know? Why? It might sting you, yes. Well, corals, sea anemones, and jellies have those stinging cells like Diver Glenn was talking about. So you never want to touch those things. So they find their food that way, but when people were answering the question what a coral was, some of them thought corals were a plant, but guess what, audience? You weren't too far off if you thought coral was a plant. And why is that, Diver Glenn?
Well, actually, bark corals have this trick. Bark corals can't really live without an algae that lives inside its skin. And that algae is called zooxanthellae. And what happens, actually, is the way it feeds and the way it survives, since sunlight comes down through this nice clear water, which is why water quality is so important to a coral. And it comes down through and it hits that zooxanthellae, that algae that lives inside the skins of the coral. That algae then does what's called photosynthesis, which is a kind of a big word, but all it means is that it takes sunlight and turns it into sugar. And that's a pretty cool trick. In fact, that's the basis of life on the planet for all intents and purposes. It actually takes that sugar and then it feeds it to the coral. And it gives about 90% of that sugar to the coral to eat.
That's amazing. So the coral animal feeds itself with the stinging cells, and especially during the daytime, the plant, the algae takes over when the sun is shining.
That's right, yeah.
Wow, and that amount that it gives the coral animal, that's a high price to pay, 90%. But otherwise, it would be eaten by all these beautiful fish, wouldn't it?
Yep, it actually gives it a nice, safe place to live, and it feeds it, and it actually gets something from the corals itself. It actually gets carbon dioxide, and it's got a cool trick. When it takes in the carbon dioxide, it also makes oxygen. Now everyone take a deep breath, and that's about 21% oxygen. About 80% of that oxygen came out of the ocean at some point. So the oceans are very, very important to life on the planet.
Yes, and that's